the idea of people now streaming is becoming very common, which is not so intuitive when you look at countries where even 5 years ago it was difficult to get a smartphone and some kind of data to stream the songs. So I find that to be very promising.
I think the most important thing for an artist is to have a strategy that their heart's in, and to get really good at manifesting what it is that you want.
The basic idea is that in Web3 you have a bunch of different new tools to build out organizations and to build out relationships with people, and probably most fundamentally, to shift the idea of what ownership means in a creative or other economy.
Hi, and welcome to a talk which is called "The Streaming Economy, Is There No Alternative?" I'm here tonight with Emika, with Benjamin Lebrave, with Matt Dryhurst. My name is Kristoffer Cornils. I'm a music journalist. And before I properly introduce the participants tonight, and before we start talking, I just wanted to provide some facts and maybe also stats, especially numbers, on how things are going with streaming as a whole. And they're going incredibly well, even though the music industry might tell you otherwise. The reported revenue in 2020 was $23 billion for the global recorded music industry. 23.1 billion. And that isn't because we all stayed locked inside our houses and just, I don't know, were streaming Justin Bieber's workout playlists while doing our exercises. That is part of a larger trend, and that can be pretty much exclusively traced back to the success of streaming, because out of those 23.1 billion US dollars, 14.2 billion came from streaming. And essentially, this means that streaming right now is generating already pretty much as much money as the entire global recorded music industry did in the year 2015, which is not so long ago. And to put things even more in perspective, we can look at the US market, where streaming today already makes up 80% of all revenue on the music market. And we can compare this to the income, to the revenue in 2010, which was only 7%. So basically, and we all hate exponential growth by now, but that's what's been happening. And this also, of course, means that consumer behavior has changed. According to a recent estimation by media, there's now 487 million people in the world who have access to a paid music streaming service subscription, and that's paid. That's not people who use Spotify for free, but roughly 500 million people probably by now who are actually paying for music streaming services, which is good news, right? Because also this means that people are paying more than they did before, whereas your average consumer would maybe buy 3 or 4 CDs back then when that was still a thing, or the occasional download. No, now they are basically banging out 10 euros a month or something, so 120 euros just for one service. Maybe they have another as well. And things are going well. So why is everybody complaining? Why are we sitting here? And well, that's because all these good news for the music industry read like bad news to a lot of songwriters and performers once they get their royalty checks in the mail. And we've heard all about that, and we've heard a lot more in those past 1.5 years where musicians basically couldn't go on tour, couldn't sell merch to people who were half drunk after the gig at the merch table, because that's a little easier than just selling stuff on Bandcamp Friday. And royalties from streaming are, well, yeah, there's not really much that's actually arriving on the bank accounts of musicians. And the DSPs, the digital streaming platforms, usually get blamed for that, but that is only part of the story. The problem is a lot more complex because there's also labels, distributors, and aggregators and other intermediaries who basically take their cut before any money makes its way to songwriters and performers. And in addition to that, we have rising competition on the platforms. I've said it earlier to someone, there's currently 7 million artists on Spotify, for example. And that's a lot of people to compete with. And Spotify and Apple Music especially investing heavily in podcasts makes it even harder for musicians to actually, get basic visibility, I would say. And of course, most of the DSPs are also pretty much dominated by the 3 major labels, plus, before we forget those, the Merlin network, which is basically essentially a 4th major label, you could say, a conglomerate of indie labels that also have a lot of power on those platforms. And anyone who isn't represented by those 4 is without a financial safety net, I would argue. And I can also provide some numbers on that. Looking at Spotify again, Spotify paid out roughly $5 billion, which is, pretty much like a third of those 14 billion US dollars that streaming revenue was in 2020. And out of those 5 billion, 4.5 billion, so almost all of it, went to only 0.8% of artists on the platform. So you can imagine that a lot of people basically received little to nothing. And this is due to competition, this is due to major label dominance and all of that. And so here we are now. The music industry is doing pretty well. It doesn't need our advice, but maybe some other people do, and some other people are interested in that because, it's not going well for your regular artist. And this is not only me saying this, but also that was the conclusion of a report issued by the Committee for Digital, Culture, Media, and for some reason Sport in the UK Parliament very, very recently, which had some MPs call for and I quote, complete reset of the music industry, which sounds very attractive, but also very utopian for now, which is why we will discuss some things that are happening now, some alternatives within streaming, outside of streaming, and also, I guess, we will have to confront the idea whether, or maybe just, ask ourselves if talking about streaming is not even worth it. And so like I said, tonight's participants are Emika, Benjamin Lebrave, and Matt Dryhurst. I'm starting with Benjamin. He founded Akwaaba-Music in 2008, a label that focuses pretty much exclusively on African music, especially from Ghana, where Akwaaba is based in Accra. And apart from the label services, Akwaaba also serves as an agency, and Benjamin himself has worked and works as a freelance consultant or advisor of sorts for artists from Ghana and the African continent, as well as cultural institutions. And he can shed some light on a market that is barely being discussed, actually, when we talk about streaming, because most streaming discussions pretty much exclusively revolve around the European markets and the Northern American markets, much like any other discussion. Benjamin, thanks for joining us. And next up is Emika, a composer, producer, singer, and also much, much more, who started out releasing 2 albums and several EPs on the label Ninja Tune before eventually starting her own record label. Now it's already 2 labels that you have, and she's been working independently ever since, so essentially for almost a decade now, and has always pretty successfully experimented with other sources of income and ways of sustaining herself. For example, crowdfunding the recording of an entire symphony, And currently she is using platforms like Bandcamp, but also Patreon, especially Patreon, to both, well, generate some income while also building a community around her. And she's also a bit of a slice of good news as well, celebrating the 10-year anniversary of her debut album with some new music instead of the coffee table book and box set. The Vega trilogy. I hope that was, yeah, okay. And last but not least, we have Matt Dryhurst, who is an artist and known also as a frequent collaborator of Holly Herndon, for example, with whom he also hosts the podcast Interdependence. And a lot of his work focuses on, well, rethinking certain things that go wrong in the music industry, I would say, especially economically, especially in terms of ownership, agency, and, well, basically questioning the status quo of technological infrastructures within the music world, I would say. And thus he has been very active in the field of the Web3, as it's called, basically anything blockchain-based, especially DAOs or DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, and NFTs, non-fungible tokens. And yeah, so 3 perspectives, very, very different ones. And I'm going to start with Benjamin, because you were suggested as a participant for this talk by Pamela Owusu-Brenya, one of the curators here, who said, well, we need someone to say something good about streaming. And you're that person, which is like, why? No, but seriously, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about the recent developments, especially on the African continent when it comes to streaming, and how African artists especially benefited from those.
Okay. So I've been working, I started my company Akwaaba-Music, because at the time, this is about 13 years ago, a lot of music that came out locally throughout the African continent did not have actual distribution, right? So you couldn't find that music at all. So the initial idea was to bridge that gap. I won't go over the whole history, but that has changed radically, right? Where today, if you come to Ghana, you'll realize that a lot of artists, a vast majority of artists, have their songs on all major platforms. And what I see as a very positive development is 10 years ago or 15 years ago, before I moved there, artists, there was absolutely no transparency, let alone opportunity for artists to see any kind of income from outside of Ghana or outside of Senegal, Ivory Coast, wherever they're from. So that I find to be quite amazing, that they can actually get a piece of the pie directly, right? Mm-hmm. So when I talk about this pie, I'm mostly talking about the Western country pie, Spotify, Deezer, Apple Music. Now, in terms of streaming on the continent, you might, if you look into it, you'll see, tantalizing statistics, which do not translate into much income. It's promising, and that's a whole separate conversation. But at least the idea of people now streaming is becoming very common, which is not so intuitive when you look at countries where even 5 years ago it was difficult to get a smartphone and some kind of data to stream the songs. So I find that to be very promising, and I find the idea that you can now be connected to fans no matter where you're from, right? So of course I realize I come from a perspective where people's expectations in terms of income are not the same, right? The point, however many percent of, or 0.00 whatever cents equates to more in Ghana than it would if you were, say, in Berlin. So that's why I'm very positive, because I see streaming having an impact on people's lives, on artists' careers in a place like Ghana. Now, as we can discuss further in this discussion, this does not apply to every artist. And I've had my share of artist partners who have not benefited from streaming as well. So I'm really looking at it from a macro perspective, saying, yes, this is awesome. There's now a revenue stream coming from Spotify, coming from Apple Music, benefiting the scene in Accra. Now, the whole other debate, which I think we'll touch on with the other members here, is which pockets does this actually go to?
Yeah, I mean, that's one question. The other question is do you really especially knowing what's been happening around Northern America, Europe, and whatever, do you really think you can build a sort of like really sustainable system in Africa for streaming that basically artists, like most artists at least, can benefit from?
I don't know about most, but some, yes. And now, the thing about most is, these days, if you have $20 in a bank account, you can get your music on all platforms, right? You'll use DistroKid or TuneCore. That doesn't mean there's a market for it. That doesn't really mean there's even a need for your music. I mean, that whole question of a need for your music is kind of a touchy subject, but just because your music is up doesn't mean that it's going to work, right? And now there's an overabundance of artists, even in a place like Ghana where access is more limited than it is here. There's just too much stuff. I mean, you mentioned 7 million artists. I mean, that's insane, you know? Your numbers, I think you're much more reliable on your numbers than I am, but if I think about 10 years ago, a decade ago, or 15 years ago, there was something like 40,000 releases a year, and now I think there's about 60,000 new songs a day. That's insane. I mean, surely there's a vast majority of these people who will never make a living from it. There's just not enough ears to listen to it all.
Yeah, and which brings us to Emika, I guess, because you make a living with something else, or how much, like what percentage-wise, like how does streaming, like what does it pay you?
I mean, it changes, obviously, when your work is put on a playlist, and if it's quite a big one, and if it performs well, you stay. And so whenever I have been playlisted, I was able to perhaps have an assistant for a while or have some marketing. But as soon as you're off a playlist, it's like the drop is staggering, and it can come from one day to the next. So it's not sustainable from that aspect. And yeah, I mean, everybody knows what I get paid. People can see how many stats I have, and people know the rates. So I run my own label, so I have the best chance possible to receive the most that's available to me. But it's, yeah, I mean, I've adapted, you know. I've got used to living with less, and I produce all my records entirely on my own. And if I do need somebody or I want to collaborate, you know, we work it out artist to artist. So I would love to be able to like hire and pay people more, you know, than I do. I basically just share what I have and just run things as fairly as I can. But yeah, I've kind of just got to the end of that road now, and I've actually decided to take quite like a, I don't know, just to shake things up a little bit. Like, so it's my 10-year anniversary, and I've actually decided to just create 101 copies of my box set, and I'm selling them at a price that I want my work to be valued at. And I feel like with that group of people, so I have like roughly 150 patrons, and I really like that group. Like, it feels, it's like I can recognize people's profile images, and I remember names and stories, and it really feels good, you know, after having like years now of just platforms and updates from Apple and Shazam each week, and that's like your information and your feedback. So I've just decided, I made a really big analysis of everything the last 5 to 10 years, and decided I was either going to do something else or quit, because I just basically couldn't find any motivation at all. And I decided to keep going because I really, like through having a direct connection with my audience, I really recognize how, I don't really know how to put it, but it's like, I know that my music has definitely saved at least one person from suicide. And I know these kinds of things about my music, and I just thought, well, I need to just take what I do seriously and find a new way, and I can't just like pack it all in, because it gets a bit hard because of the current culture. So I've just decided to stop engaging with that current culture and just put my hand up, and I said, I don't have the perfect solution, but this is what I'm going to do right now. And yeah.
Yeah, and so far also Patreon works out financially for you, right?
In comparison to streaming, yeah.
Yeah. But same question as I asked Benjamin just now. Like, would you recommend this to other artists? Would you say, well, just move on to Patreon and forget about, you know, like breadcrumbs from Spotify and Apple Music?
No, I would recommend trying to set targets for yourself and create a team around what you're doing, or one person that believes in you that can help you, even if it's part-time and you have another job. Like, I think the most important thing for an artist is to have a strategy that their heart's in, and to get really good at manifesting what it is that you want. And I wouldn't advise artists to just go onto a platform or just to, like, upload your music to platform. You know, I think that's quite dangerous, and it doesn't really help artists to develop or find their way in this landscape of everything. And I think it's much better to even wait like for 3 years until you have the best music possible, and don't make any compromises, don't make any sacrifices, and just wait till it's like the best you could possibly get with everything, even if it's not perfect, you know. And then decide what you want to go after. Do you want to be famous? Do you want to make good music? Is it a mix of both? There's so many games you can play in this like world of platforms and people and fans, you know. So you've just got to decide, like, what are you in this for, and then find your way with that, you know.
Yeah, and I think especially if we're talking about such platform-based approaches to generating income, as when we're talking about Patreon and also Bandcamp to a certain extent, you can play with that, but you always play by the platform's rules, right? And that has been made abundantly clear recently by a decision by OnlyFans. It was a forced decision. It was an OnlyFans decision to essentially ban all pornography, which was the USP of that platform in the first place. Pressured into that by MasterCard. But suddenly a lot of creators were facing complete loss of income, and also the vanishing of the community, basically because, they were dependent also on that platform. And so, which brings us a little bit to Matt, of course, because, you have been talking a lot about DAOs recently. And first off, maybe in simple terms, how can we imagine a decentralized autonomous organization? It sounds very simple, but what does it mean?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so before I explain that, I guess, so people might not know the phrase Web3, but Web3 is kind of a colloquial term for, the way I would frame it, right, is like streaming, Facebook, or, Twitter or whatever was characterized as Web2, right? Web2 is like the social web that kind of happened in parallel to the proliferation of cell phones in our pockets, which actually, to your point, that's one thing I would ask. Maybe we don't want to go over it again, but, you know, one of my frustrations in a sense is that streaming kind of came along as this, you know, it was always framed as this kind of inevitable partner to everyone having cell phones in their pockets. And of course, the dynamic you're describing to me is it's an unmitigated good that people in the world now have access to the internet and have smartphones in their pockets. But that doesn't necessarily have to come along with a business model that pays them peanuts, in which they have no ownership of, you know, the value that they contribute to a particular company. And that's why we have this concentration of wealth and influence with a few companies. I'd frame Web 2.5 as being what Emika's describing, which is Patreon, which is this slight move away where you're like, okay, now I'm my own container. I'm in direct contact with my audience. Because, of course, Spotify and a lot of these Web 2 companies, the reason why you're not in contact with your audience is because that's how they make money, right? They need you to need them to get access to your audience because they collect data, they sell ads. That's their product, right? That's what they want. Web 2.5 is a little bit different because you're in direct contact, right? And like Patreon, I have a Patreon account for the podcast we do. Technically, I could start a mailing list of all the people there because I get their emails. That's kind of cool. Web 3 is a whole other kettle of fish, and it's kind of very difficult to describe in a very short period of way, but I'll get there. So most people are going to be familiar with Web3 through, let's say, the Ethereum ecosystem. It uses a blockchain. I'm not going to go into what that is. YouTube exists. But some of the basic premises of Web3, for example, is no intermediary, right? So the situation you're describing where Spotify sets one rate for the world, as if that was ever a good idea, right? Like one rate for the world. Not only one rate for the world, but one economic interaction saying that everyone's music should be valued by the amount of times it's played, right? Imagine how many Kubrick films would have been funded if they were funded by every time you played it. How many times have you read your favorite book? Not many times, probably, right? So you have these bundles of economic interactions that are led by centralized organizations. Web3, the idea is that there's no central intermediary. So what you use is you interact with protocols that allow you to set certain conditions and rules. But for example, if you were to start a Patreon-like service on Web3, there would be nobody there to say, your content this month is banned. So by the way, even though you have access to your audience technically through us, we can kick you off. You didn't meet our certain terms and conditions or whatever. In a Web3 environment, a Patreon will be there, and you would be able to just interact with different tools to interact with your audience in different ways, but that bond is between you and them, and there's no intermediary making a cut in the middle. Now, a DAO is an idea that's been around for a very long time, pre-Ethereum, 2013, 2014, is this basic idea of saying, if everyone is connected by this network, and there are no intermediaries to kind of impede things, how would we build organizations in which we could all trust each other, right? And so one characterization that has been made of DAOs on the most basic level is it's like a group of friends across the world with a shared bank account, right? But of course, if you're getting into an agreement with, you want to start an organization with a bunch of people you've never met, you need certain terms and conditions in there, certain kind of protocols for how you might interact. And DAOs help you build that, right? So you can say, for example, I'm going to start a publication with a bunch of these people who all care about the same thing as me all over the world. And the DAO, there's maybe a smart contract interaction in there. A smart contract is basically just like a vending machine. You say, you know, if money goes to me, a third of it goes to you and a third of it goes to you, right? You can program these interactions into the organization. So you're basically creating organizations through code. This all sounds very abstract. Actually, it's not abstract. In the last year or two, the tools have kind of caught up with the theory. I'm part of DAOs now that have treasuries of, you know, upwards of $100 million. They're funding new creative works. They're funding new journalism, intra the organization. This idea is here, and it's not going away. And yeah, and the other thing we haven't touched on, of course, are NFTs, which I think have been grossly kind of distorted by people's awkward attempts to kind of understand what they are. But the basic idea is that in Web3, you have a bunch of different new tools to build out organizations and to build out relationships with people, and probably most fundamentally, to shift the idea of what ownership means in a creative or other economy. Because one of the fundamental principles of Web3 that doesn't exist with Spotify, and it doesn't exist with Patreon as much as I like Patreon, is this idea that what you contribute to, you get a share of, right? And that will be the idea that kills Spotify and Patreon. And I'm 100% confident in this. Like, within the next 5 to 10 years, the amount of money, time, investment that's going into Web3, that will be the crucial idea that kills them, is that people now entering into the creative economy are going to expect to enjoy the upside of the projects that they contribute to. If you join a magazine, you want to be an equity holder in the long-term prospects of that magazine. If you join a label, you want to have a stake in that label. So switching that fundamentally, to me, is a very, very progressive and optimistic thing. And and the good news is it's already here. It's just music generally lags a couple of years behind this stuff.
Yeah, and how does it sound? How does that approach sound to you? How does it sound as a label to hear? Well, yeah, people want to basically be shareholders of your label, or as an artist maybe as well. Like, what are your thoughts on a system which works very differently from what we know? Yeah, what do you think about this, especially in looking at a field or like at a market where streaming is currently emerging, where maybe you still have some time left before streaming just covers like the entire market and just absorbs it.
I mean, it sounds amazing, actually. One thing I think is difficult to harness these days, and especially difficult to harness with streaming, is when you're a fan. The value of a fan is not just how many times he streams a song, or even how many concerts he or she attends, and that value is something that's not been. We've not had the tools to translate it, right? But now, if you can imagine, or you're saying it exists, I'm not as well versed in it.
Emika also has the tools to translate it. I mean, that is basically what they call superfan engagement, Patreon.
And it's something that, at least in Ghana, it's still not really implemented, right? And I go to concerts. I mean, what I'm going to say sounds very basic, but you go to concerts and you see the behavior of superfans, and I think to myself, how can the artist actually benefit from this besides making noise at a concert? So having these tools, and I think also we come from a perspective here where we're relatively tied in financially. We have bank accounts and bills, but there's large chunks of the world where people don't have access to that, right? So if you take the case of Ghana, now mobile money is something that's becoming prevalent, but it's still far from perfect. And when you imagine, to think that someone could actually have a stake in something that's worldwide, doesn't matter where they are, and have a say and also reap the benefits. It's fantastic.
Biggest holders of crypto per capita in the world, Nigeria.
Yeah, exactly.
And Argentina. I mean, there's many other benefits to that, but giving people a stake in things that they can participate in remotely, and that's why I wasn't trying to be shitty with the comment about the phone, but that's why I get excited about it, because I'm like, look, you have a lot of new people on a network, and it's been sold to a great many people, and this, of course, Spotify's marketing budget per week is bigger than any scene I've participated in, like yearly budget, right? This idea, I call it like streaming fatalism, that with that phone and with that connection, of course, the natural thing they'd want to do is give their product away for free. Like, how do we get convinced, in what parallel universe did we get convinced that the most, economically kind of advantageous thing an artist can do is give their shit away for free? You know what I mean? It's this absurd kind of idea. But yeah, you have a phone, you have access to a network, and this is what's funny specifically, because there's been a lot of cynicism around, I think, Web3, some of it useful, some of it constructive, but wait, I lost my train of thought, excuse me. I lost my train of thought. Never mind. Sorry.
Oh well, but maybe Emika, you can say something about this, because we talked prior to this conversation. We also had a little chat where you also mentioned, at least following the NFT market, for example, so block-based, blockchain-based solutions. What's your stance on that? Do you see any potential for you as a solo artist, as a label owner?
I mean, as an independent artist, yeah, for sure. I think that the full potential of NFTs is not really fully understood yet. From what I've seen, people are applying very old models into the NFT space and not really being that creative with it. I guess I've been following blockchain in a broader sense for around 4 or 5 years through my astrologer, who's been charting it and talking to me a lot about it. And yeah, it's like a whole new dimension, I would say. It's not even like a subculture or a different world. It's actually a new dimension where there's collectivism again, and people are seeking something that's better than what we have. And I'd say the most intelligent people that I speak to and meet are in that world. Not in the other world of of traditional music. It really feels old to me now, to have these conversations about playlists and DSPs and stuff like this just seems so old-fashioned even to me now. And I only started my label in 2015, and at that time it was whoa, this new thing, you can be on a playlist, the music industry is going to be saved, and yeah, but I think the problem specifically with NFTs and art and music is I guess because everybody in the art world, especially also visual artists, have been so they're treated even worse than musicians. There's no Spotify for visual artists, and but they're freer, so I don't know what's worse. But yeah, I kind of feel that the NFT space is just polluted with junk and nonsense. And just the words of minting stuff. I don't know, I don't like it so much right now. And I am getting my first NFT ready, and I'm going to be selling it, but I think I'm going to do it off marketplaces and just privately. And there's one thing I will say about this world, it's you can't really go to university. You can't be hi, I'd like to join and can bring this. It's you have to find your way in, and you have to kind of like build a reputation, and people like, you know, they like a cosign means something, like it's totally different, and it really is like this new dimension that really works on like trust and has created its own new, it's not really a new perspective on value, but it's like it's what value, like if you look up the definition of value in a dictionary, like in that world that's real, and in this world it's like just an illusion, you know. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think all of this sounds very positive and very nice. But like I mentioned, we almost have like 500 million people on this earth already, just being so used to streaming that they actually pay for it. How do we get those people to invest in NFTs? And secondly, I think NFTs are controversial for a lot of wrong reasons. But I think something that really disincentivizes people from really getting into that field is because maybe they feel it's not really accessible, or that you need a certain literacy, like a technological literacy for that. Because I don't know if anyone from the audience has ever heard of that stuff, but it sounds very technical. There's a lot of jargon and a lot of acronyms involved, and that's kind of hard to, just to wrap your head around, I guess, isn't it? I don't know.
And I would say that that's generally like the mainstream is like really threatened by this. So they've made it seem very difficult and challenging. And like there's, you know, I've been reading articles in like Billboard, for example, that, you know, the headline is like, you still don't understand what an NFT is. But it's like a lot of people, it's not that hard to understand, you know. And I think that just this whole world is like really threatened and trying to like dampen it. There was the whole climate thing that got thrown at NFTs. But nobody wants to think like how much energy does Spotify actually use, how many like data farms does
or
YouTube
printing your
have?
music on oil
Or making vinyl, everything's shrink wrapped. There's rules like if you want to distribute your records in Amazon, they have to be shrink wrapped now. There was a big thing that I had with my distributor. I decided not to shrink wrap anything, and then it was like I get this red email that everything has to be shrink wrapped in order to distribute to Amazon. It's like, well, no worries. I sell like 23 records in Amazon. Like that's not where my fans are.
I'm glad you said that though, because I also think, I mean, I'm playing like a villain in some ways here, but like I feel like the word accessibility gets thrown around a lot, and it's often kind of like, you know, a lot of us here mostly, it sounds like from what you're doing, we're coming from a legacy, for better and worse, of like independent music. I'm critical of that legacy, but I'm very appreciative of it because it's where I come from. Can you imagine how hard it would have been to have set up your own label in like 1983 with no access to the internet? Can you imagine like all the people who did that, which basically built the foundations for every subculture that is existing here and in this room? Can you imagine how difficult that would be? And then I have people, and I get there is jargon, but I mean like, musical subcultures are full of jargon too, right? Like I remember vividly being like 17 and like forcing myself to learn to appreciate Dillinger Escape Plan or something. Because it was like, I don't like it, but all the cool people like it, so I have to like it. You like obsess and you get into it. And it's like, you can learn as much as you need to learn to set yourself up in Web3 in about 3 hours on YouTube, literally. Like, and there is a bit of jargon to get there. But the important thing, and I think you made a great point about NFTs earlier, actually, is that there's, I'm trying to think of a better word. It's kind of like a skeuomorphic, or like there's this kind of desire to take what we have right now, which most people aren't really happy with, and then port it over to this world that's entirely different. And that doesn't work super well. And actually that's a feature that's like an advantage of this new world. But in order to figure out what your idea might be in the new world, and the benefit of a decentralized system is that there's going to be a million of them, right? There's not one company that says, we're moving to video. Like, you better start getting into video or you're not going to have a career anymore. There's going to be a million different ways to experiment economically in this new ecosystem. In order to do that, you do have to do the basic requirement of like going to YouTube and doing the tutorials. And as much of a slog as that is, I keep coming back to that thing, is like, I cannot imagine how difficult, I mean, you're setting up a network to, you know, to work and represent artists who are off the grid, you know, globally. Like, that's a very difficult task to do, and I'm really glad that you're doing that, right? Like, I think people can put the effort in to do that, given how high the stakes are, particularly when it comes down to their own economic and professional freedom, you know, that spend a weekend on YouTube, you know, let's...
Yeah, so sounds like it's a good moment for you to look into that, right? Into DAOs, and I think we're actually pretty much out of time already, right? Because we started 40 minutes, and this was we already started late, and this was 40 minutes. What's our recap? Well, streaming can be nice, but essentially...
And one thing I'd like to add, I'm sorry, I'll make it really quick, but we're discussing all of this from the point of view of either, let's say, observing the system or producing the music, but I think the perspective from the fans' point of view. And I have kind of weird, quirky taste in music.
We still got 10 minutes, sorry.
Okay. I have, let's say, left field taste, but so I'm always in this weird position where I like to put out kind of, non-commercial music, but it's the commercial side of my catalog that enables me to pay for my rent, right? And I've come to the realization that people are not necessarily as curious or willing to spend that much time for music as we might suspect, And I think a lot of these tools we're talking about and a lot of this energy that might be required, I mean, I'd like to think that that's the way forward it'll work, but sometimes I ask myself, like, do people want this? How satisfied are the fans, or let's put the word fan aside, let's call them customers, customers of Spotify and Apple Music. Are they unhappy, or are they totally fine with the system? Because at the end of the day, it's their say that'll, ultimately they're the ones who pay the money.
Yeah. But how do you think that audience can be reached and maybe nudged a little into at least a better sort of streaming? For example, I mean, there's alternative streaming services, like there's Resonate, which is a co-op. There's Audius now, which is, I think, blockchain based. There's been suggestions by, for example, Liz Pelly, who's doing a great work, essentially suggesting public streaming. Just as we have public TV, public radio, why shouldn't we have public streaming? How can do you think that essentially people's minds can be changed in that regard, or are they just so used to streaming that it's absolutely impossible and we just have to deal with this? Is there really no alternative, essentially?
I mean, I would go beyond streaming and just talk about music discovery. Mm-hmm. And I think whether it's streaming or before streaming, radio or MTV or whatever it was, I was a big believer that the internet will allow for a lot more different music to flourish. And, 13 years into it, I've come to realize that it's not an obvious statement to make. And, pop music is still huge and people still follow huge artists. And for me, that's the fundamental problem. Before we even look at the technique, whether it's streaming or something else, is like, how much are people looking for something different? And I don't have a clear answer. Like, I'm torn, because I like to think that people do want something, but when I look at the numbers at the end of the month, they seem to say something different.
Yeah, but I was also about to ask you. I mean, you've made some great experiences with that. Basically, going a little bit in a left field direction musically, you did something completely else. And why would you say that worked out for you?
Because I manifested it from my heart. So it didn't have any duality with it. It's like it just came from my heart and people could feel that. And I think that, no offense, but all of these worlds are kind of essentially boys' clubs, and there's a lot of theory to it, and there's a lot of there isn't really a balanced energy in any of these worlds. And then I kind of came along with some projects that I made with my heart, and I think that just really resonated, and it didn't matter necessarily. I mean, it wasn't such a big leap, I'd always been sampling my own classical stuff within my beat music, so then to do something that was pure classical stuff made sense. But yeah, I don't know, for me, I just feel like all of these worlds are basically just full. They just need balancing. There's a lack of balance, and I think when there is a balance, there will be this attractive energy. Right now it just feels unbalanced. All of these worlds to me feel unbalanced, and I don't think you're going to capture the mainstream until the energy and the vibe is good with anything actually that you're doing.
Yeah, and I think that is also a huge problem if we talk about blockchain technology, right? That basically it's been talked about a lot, but it hasn't really been widely adopted.
It has. I disagree. Like, and this was actually when I lost my train of thought earlier. I think we have conversations, about the relative merits of this stuff. I go into Discords. I was in one earlier, and it's full of kids from India, from the Philippines, from Nigeria. They get it immediately. They are super resourceful. They're on YouTube. They figure it out. It has been adopted significantly. Like, I think it's something along the lines of like $400 million has been transacted in NFTs this week. You wouldn't hear that from reading the newspaper. I mean, like, the NFTs died apparently 5 months ago. It's just, it has been adopted, but there are some challenges, I think, where there's also kind of a media transition happening there, where like, there's not yet a lot of people outside of that world who have enough fluency in what's going on to be able to represent it. And if they do, it tends to be something like financial reporting or something like that, which isn't cool. This is not like something. But I would say there it has been adopted. And the other thing I can say from my side is that like in the next 12 to 18 months, like everyone is on board. Like, the things that I hear and see put in front, I'm just like, there is so much money going into this that like people understand that this is, for better and worse, it's not a panacea. It's not going to solve all our problems. The good news is that it's going to present 1,000 different problems rather than one stubborn problem that you can't do anything about, right? But it's already there. Like if you follow the money and you follow the attention, like all of VC basically has come to the conclusion that this is the future of culture. For better and worse. So all the things that need to be activated for this to go forward are happening, but it's kind of been rolling out slowly, And so I would make the argument that it's already here, and that's why I communicate with some urgency. It's worthwhile getting your head around it because, that kind of like capital inflow or whatever like dictates the future. Like there's a lot of people who are very invested in this idea of it working out. But it is still somewhat mysterious to people, and I think part of that is just a media problem. It's just when this stuff is represented, it's always talked about as some like random thing that some nerds are doing, and it's just like not true, Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't have any representation. That's why it's just left to be criticized.
Totally, and it doesn't need it. That's the thing too, because I mean, that's the other side to it is that there's also so much money for better and worse in that world. That they're building parallel media systems. Like they don't need. It's like it's a joke. Like the New York Times writes about NFTs and people laugh about it. It's not like a.
So what's your blog? Where's your YouTube channel?
I don't. No, I have a podcast and we talk. Okay. Generally, the podcast part of the idea is that we talk to founders of protocols about things. So, but mostly from an artist perspective. So we do that on the podcast, and part of the idea is to like familiarize people with. The idea there, and then we try and ask kind of a bit more difficult questions because we're not like shilling anything. It's like, okay, cool. Like you say, you're going to help artists. Like, how exactly are you going to accomplish this? Yeah, but we do it in podcast form because it's kind of efficient. It's like we can do a 2-hour thing a week.
Where's your podcast?
Sorry?
Where's your podcast?
It's called Interdependence. It's like interdependence.fm.
Okay, but I think now we've reached the end, and maybe there are some questions. I think thank you all for now, very much. And if there's any questions from the audience, I think you can just get up and shout, because anything else would not really be hygienic. Nope. Hey. Oh, no, this.
Basic tutorial on what Ethereum is. Ethereum. So Ethereum is it's kind of the second largest. It's kind of, when we talk about building applications in a blockchain environment, it's the biggest environment. Bitcoin exists, but it's kind of a separate thing. So look at what Ethereum is. One of the people who wrote the initial code for Ethereum is a guy called Vitalik Buterin. He has a great blog where he makes a broader historical context, and if you want to go deeper, he's actually really great to read about the potential there. I would look into things like a MetaMask wallet, because everything in crypto is run from a wallet rather than a profile. You're kind of an identity. Your identity is connected to your wallet. And then I would look up things like DAOs, things like NFTs. And it's important to understand that like these are just file types, right? So when most people say NFTs, they think of funny monkey pictures or something, you know? But that's just an image that's been attached to a file type. It's kind of like a piece of HTML or some like basic stuff. But yeah, and the only thing I will say, obviously, in this like full, the disclaimer there is, of course, when you are searching this stuff, because there's a lot of money circulating in that world, like, be careful. Like, don't put money into stuff unless you understand it. You know what I mean?
That's not my...
Got it. But this is being recorded, so I kind of have to say that, you know? But it's the truth, because there's also, because there's a lot of money circling around, there's also a lot of vultures circling around, so you can go down rabbit holes and then someone will be telling you can make like $1 million tomorrow and don't believe them, right? But in terms of the fundamentals, there's a lot of great, I can't think of them off the top of my head.
You can make $1 million.
You can. Hypothetically, you can if you get really lucky, but I wouldn't, I'm guessing you most likely won't. So like, yeah, but YouTube's full of people and you can kind of figure out within the first couple of minutes whether or not it's trustworthy.
That was Joey. Another question?
Yeah, I hope it's on topic enough. So, some of you, especially now, were saying how eventually with Web3, things will be more decentralized and there'll be a lot more control and choice over how artists share their work. But the whole streaming thing only touches on pre-recorded music, so I was wondering how you see the live experience of going. How might that evolve in parallel with the consumption of recorded music?
I would just like to say that live music is happening also on Spotify and anywhere else. Mixcloud, there's a lot of DSPs who are offering Bandcamp as well, which is not a DSP, but it's also a DSP. So live music is happening there as well. And that is mostly, kind of a Patreon deal, sort of, like a for subscribers, or like a one-time payment that is happening, which is like, just attending a digital concert, I guess.
For a lot of people, it's really about being in the same room as, I don't know, maybe not. That's why I'm asking the question. So if anyone has anything to speculate, I'm curious.
I can. I think specifically as pertains to Web3, there's been a lot of experiments I'm personally not that interested in with ticketing. It solves some problems with ticketing because the whole idea of like scalping or hoarding can be controlled in ways that don't currently exist or work that well. There's also been experiments in kind of like gatekeeping, not to use the pejorative use of that term, but like the literal use of that term, right? Like token unlock access to things. I've been to Raise, for example, where you needed to have a token in your wallet and scan your wallet to be there. These to me are kind of skeuomorphic, to use the example that Emika kind of made earlier. It's kind of like, let's take the old world and like stick it on the blockchain. I'm like, well, live music works just fine without tech, actually. Like you need this very low tech environment. It's great. It's going to outlive all other music industry environments, by the way. Like, right, it's great. I'm personally interested in when you talk about having a group of people being invested in something and being able to own a piece of something, which is kind of a fundamental part of Web3, the most interesting application to me for that is the idea of large groups of people co-owning clubs, large groups of people co-owning brick and mortar. Now, there's a bad side to that because there's also a rapidly approaching reality in which, right now you can go to any major city in Europe or whatever and like half of it's owned by invisible money somewhere, right? And it's just squatted there. Imagine if you can fractionalize that. Imagine if like a whole street in like a nice suburb of Beijing can own a whole street in Berlin, but they own just a little piece of it, right? There's good and bad sides to this, but the idea, for example, of saying there's a crew in city X that actually there's like 10,000 people around the world who really enjoy this, but they can't attend. But rather than thinking about selling music, for example, you could give them some ownership in a brick and mortar space that facilitated the continuation of that music. That to me is really exciting. And that's something you couldn't do before, right? So I think there's lots of ideas like that particularly cross-border support, stuff like that, I think is really fascinating. But we don't really have an analogy for that. There's a few co-op clubs that people know, but that kind of stuff to me is more interesting for live music because that's the stuff that makes live music happen, right? And like, if you're thinking about like sticking a token into a very genuine human interaction, like, why would you want to do that? It seems like kind of superfluous. But the idea of saving the space that facilitates the culture, that sounds great. Like, if you can use these tools to do more stuff like that, I think that's really cool.
Any more questions? Doesn't look like it. So then, yeah, what's our recap? I guess as long as streaming works, that's okay, but we shouldn't rely on it. And the future is out there, and that's a nice thing.
Sounds good.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Okay. Thanks for coming by. Thanks for watching, and thanks, Matt, Benjamin, Emika, for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.